All right, good morning, everybody. Friday. Just a few quick announcements before we get started. Another announcement, there'll be a talk at the Bade Museum where we had the field trips on May 6th, and that's actually going to be led by my old professor from UC San Diego, Tom Levy, who actually incidentally also runs a field school in Jordan, which again I might not recommend unless you really want to get dysentery drinking bad water out of his ears, which happens pretty much every time he goes out there. Anyway, his talk is entitled Masters of Fire, the Hereditary Bronze Casters of South India. And really I think what he's going to be doing is looking at the connection between the process of bronze casting, the social implications, and he works on early Bronze Age copper production in a place called Wadi Fena, which is near modern Petra. So it should be a really interesting talk. I'm not quite sure what approach he's going to take, but it should be very interesting. So keep that in mind. And then also, I came across this story the other day. This looks really interesting. Have you seen this, Tony? This story that came across from Galilee? Yeah. It's just a recent discovery by divers in the Sea of Galilee. This giant monumental stone structure, which was found in the Sea of Galilee. And this massive pile of basalt, as you can see, 32 feet high and then about 230 feet in circumference. This massive discovery that, again, at one point probably was not covered by the water. They're estimating this might be from as early as 3000 BC. So just very unclear as to what it is right now, but it looks like it might be a burial cairn structure to mark burials. So those of you interested in underwater archaeology, Israel is a great place to do it, and of course, really interesting things to find there. Any questions before we get started, before we pick up where we left off last time? Continuing with the Neo-Assyrian period. Just drop this here. Is that too dark? Are you guys able to see? You're not going to fall asleep on me? Okay. All right, so let's continue where we left off. We were talking about Shalmaneser and the establishment of Fort Shalmaneser, this Ekal Masharti or Show Palace at Nimrud, right on the other side of the mound, across from the Northwest Palace. Shalmaneser III, who really embarked on this system of systematic expansion of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, primarily, right, focusing on the west and bringing the Neo-Hittites and the Aramaeans under control, right? We talked about how he displaced thousands of these people, moving them to other parts of the empire, both for labor, for their skills as craftsmen, and also, right, to unsettle them politically and be able to control those regions a little bit better. We looked at some of the objects found at Fort Shalmaneser, or this Ekal Masharti, and among them, thousands and thousands of these ivories, which we left off with last time. Now, ivory carving, we should say, we see very early on, and we should keep in mind that the Middle East, Syria, the Levant, right, modern Israel, Jordan, and Syria, was a very different place in the Iron Age than it was, today. For one thing, the climate was quite different, and also the flora and fauna were different, right? We actually have evidence of elephants living in Syria at this time, so a lot of these ivories might have been resourced locally. That said, we know a lot of ivory is also being brought in from Egypt, right? Because it's African elephants primarily that give you a lot of ivory. But hippos, too. Hippos also produce ivory, so we see a combination of elephant and hippo ivory. And specialists are actually able to determine, with some degree of difficulty, the difference between hippo ivory and elephant ivory. Regardless, ivory is a great way it's a wonderful material to work in artistically. It's easy to carve. It's of course high value. It's portable, right? It can be carried over long distances. These filials, these pieces of furniture that we looked at, can travel large distances. And what's more, it's quite plastic. You can actually use small pieces of ivory and fit them together and make larger compositions. So many of these pieces at Fort Shalmaneser at Nimrud were actually several pieces of ivory that were fit together in a very intricate way to create these large compositions, such as this, which would have been the back of a throne. The artistic motifs that are found in these ivories typically reflect the traditions of the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians are inheritors of Canaanite civilization during the Late Bronze Age. We'll talk about the Phoenicians in depth next week, but primarily it's iconography that is not Assyrian. And we've seen, right, in the objects that these Assyrian kings wore, in the reliefs that they decorated their palaces with, a very clear program of iconography, this program that goes hand in hand with Assyrian ideology. In this case, and in this form, the sorts of motifs are very specific. They're very Egyptianizing. They're very North Syrian in style, not Assyrian in style. So really what we see happening is as kings like Shalmaneser III are imposing themselves on the western periphery, taking over the Neo-Hittites, the Aramaeans, the Israelites even, Phoenicians as well. We see the wholesale adoption of these clear traits, which are culturally specific, and then the Assyrians, right, are using them to display, again, control over these regions, right? So this is conspicuous consumption. This is Assyria using the traits of its conquered peoples to really boost up its own prestige. Just like the Bit Halani, we see the use of these ivories in excess, and thousands of them stored in that Ekal Masharti, the Fort Shalmaneser, where they were probably stripped of gold. You can see here in this example, this wonderful example. This is an Egyptian motif of a lioness actually biting a Nubian. You can find this in Egyptian New Kingdom iconography as well, sort of symbolic of the king, in this case, dominating peoples to the south, Nubians, so a very Egyptian piece with these lotiform buds, all of it, right, inlaid with carnelian, with gold, as you can see, right, and also blue frit and faience. So these would have been just absolutely stunning pieces overall, probably stripped of their precious materials, and then, as we said, thousands of them thrown into wells after the destruction of the Northwest Palace. When we get to the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, we'll revisit this destruction. I should also say many of these ivories probably date to earlier periods, the Late Bronze Age, into the Iron Age, and we can actually tell by the artistic hands, the proportions of the face, the use of specific traits in the way that ears and eyes and headdresses are formed, the specific workshops that these ivory carvers are coming from. So we find sets of pieces that exhibit similar traits. And there's been a lot of work by art historians, Marion Feldman, who used to be in this department, Irene Winter, a whole bunch, Christine Halliday, all these art historians who've tried to determine these specific styles. What is Assyrian style? What is Phoenician style? What is local? What's foreign? With varying degrees of success. Regardless, in terms of the Assyrians, right? Again, this is a way of showing an exotic good and reinforcing that imperial ideology we talked about last time. So, ivory carving. We've been looking primarily at these regions to the west that Shalmaneser III is able to focus his attention on in his expansion. And right, we talked quite a bit about how geography limited this Assyrian expansion, both with the Zagros and Taurus mountain ranges, right, that sort of branch off, make it very difficult to traverse. That said, we do have evidence of large kingdoms and confederations of people living in the north, and primarily they're focused around these two lake regions. This is Lake Van and Lake Urmia. And it's during the reign of Shalmaneser III that these people sort of get a name. and they're known as the Urartu, better known as Urartu. Today, this region spans parts of Turkey, Iran, Armenia, Iraq, and in these references, again, from the time of Shalmaneser III, we see the difficulty of imposing Assyrian power in these northern regions, right? Trying to get through the mountains. Shalmaneser, right in his gates, shows the tenacity of the Assyrian Empire as they try to get over these mountains, right? Those are, again, our stylized mountains, right, with their little tiny mountains here. Right, of course, you know, this individual helping this chariot make its way up and over the mountains so that, that these people in the region of Lake Van, and Lake Van particularly, can come under Assyrian control. It's really in the 9th century and during the time of Shalmaneser that this region comes under the control of one king, a king named Aramu, around 860. And what we see is the emergence of a very strong confederation of states that poses a serious threat to Assyria. It really becomes a rival state in the north and a serious problem for these Assyrian kings. I'm going to back up a little bit. Originally, right, these were confederations of city-states. City-states such as this one right here, which is called Hassanlu. And Hassanlu, as you can see, is just south of Lake Urmia. It's in the western Azerbaijani province in Iran currently. And what we see at Hassanlu, there's Hassanlu again, right here. And this is, again, another map from Rofe that you can check. These are different kings mentioned by inscription in the region. So we can actually see the spread and the establishment of Urartu as a state. But the site of Hassanlu itself gets its start very early on. It's known from Assyrian sources to be the location of a kingdom known as Manai. Again, first recorded during the reign of Shalmaneser III, but it dates back to the late Bronze Age. We don't have any written documents from this site, so we don't know its ancient name, but it was excavated in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and really indicates that a complex society was able to marshal extensive resources here and had contact with Assyria during this time. From the 9th century particularly, we have evidence of monumental architecture that's very particular in style, and also architecture that was destroyed severely, probably around 800 BCE in a great fire. So much so that this level is actually referred to in excavation reports as the burnt level. This period in which these public buildings and courtyards at Hassanlu were destroyed. We see here that the site itself is composed of 4 major buildings. You can see them here, right? 1, 2, 3, and 4. And it seems as though we're not quite clear as to what this complex, right, which is organized around 2 central courtyards, one here and one here, right? 2 courtyards, again, that makes us start thinking about a palace. However, this would be very, very different, as in each of these 4 buildings we find an altar. You can see them 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are surrounded by pillars, which would have kept these large open roofs, these large